Coming up on episode 127 of Create If Writing, I'm talking about how to create binge-worthy content.
I can't go back to sleep, it's almost light. These restless thoughts have kept me up again tonight.
Hello and welcome to Create If Writing. I'm your host, Kirsten Oliphant, and I'm so glad that you are joining me today for this podcast episode. If you are a first-time listener, or you just like to hear the sound of what you're listening to every week, this is the podcast for writers, bloggers, and creatives who want to build an online platform without being smarmy. And today I'm talking about something that is really relevant to all of us, and I think we can all relate to based on the emails I got from you guys this week, and that is how to create binge-worthy content. So in my last week's email, which is called the Quick Fix, it goes out on Fridays. If you're not already getting it, you can go to createifwriting.com/quick fix. I asked a question, and I ask a lot of questions in my emails, and it's fun for me to see which ones you guys hit reply to and which ones you don't. So this week was a big one, and I shared that I binged on a particular show last week and did basically almost nothing else. And I'll share what that is at the end of the episode. But I asked you guys, hey, do you ever do this whole binging thing with books or movies or TV shows, whatever? Hit reply, let me know. And so a ton of you guys did. I didn't count the replies, but it was a lot of them, and shared a lot of Netflix shows and not a lot of books, which is interesting. I feel like I don't binge series, but I get into a book, and when I hit a certain point, I can't stop at that book. I have to stay up. I don't care what day of the week it is. If I have to get up at 5 or 6 with kids, I'm going to finish the book. So I guess that's considered binging just one book. But I think when we talk about binging these days in the Netflix era, as I'm going to call it, we are thinking about serial content, like not just one piece of content, but moving from one to the next. And so that's actually what I want to talk about, is creating content, first of all, that people read all of, and then also that they continue reading and go on to the next thing. So I have a few things to say about this, and then some tips for you guys on this. And I'll have more in the show notes, which will be up at createifwriting.com/127 for episode 127. So first of all, I want to say that there is a difference between binge-worthy content and viral content, and both are good. A lot of people will engage with these kinds of posts, but the difference is this: binge-worthy is more like one person continuing to read, and viral is where something takes off and people continue to share. So I will have an episode in the future talking about viral content and how to create that. And they might serve two different purposes. Viral is sort of more about discoverability. You're getting a lot of eyeballs, but binge-worthy is where you're really going from the reader to the raving fan, because people are not just checking out one piece of content on your site, they're going to multiple. And something that's important to look at when you're trying to figure out if you have binge-worthy content, at least on the blog side, is to look at Google Analytics and check out your bounce rate. Now, it's not always bad to have a high bounce rate, especially if you have a lot of traffic from Pinterest, because a lot of times people will click through to kind of glance and see, is this really what it looks like? Do I actually want to pin this? What is it? And then they leave. So you've answered their question, you've satisfied, whatever it is that they wanted to know. But it also means that they're not clicking around anywhere else on your site. They check that page out and then they bounce. And so a really high bounce rate is an indication of that. Now, conversely, and this is something I hear talked about a lot in blogger groups, if you have like a 10% bounce rate, then you probably have Google Analytics installed twice on your site. I hear about this a lot. And I'm not going to get super technical, but if that's you, you might want to reach out in the Facebook community and ask questions, and we can get you straightened out there. But often bounce rates are, I would say anywhere from like 40 to 80%. I realized actually last year that I needed to change hosts, or maybe 2 years ago, when my bounce rate skyrocketed to like 97% on my KirstenOliphant.com lifestyle blog. And what I found was happening was that I started actually tracking through downnotifier.com, my site, and my site was down daily because I was with Bluehost. And sorry, Bluehost, I have had horror stories and know too many horror stories from friends personally, but really terrible service over there. My site did fine for a few years. And then, all the indicators on the site started showing that there was a problem, and that was the problem. And the bounce rate went down when I moved to SiteGround because my site is no longer down every single day. It is up every single day. So if you are looking to switch hosts, just letting you know, I'm an affiliate for SiteGround. Highly recommend them. I'm a user. You can actually get your hookup for them at creativewriting.com/SiteGround. They're not a sponsor or anything. I'm just an affiliate and a happy customer. So bounce rate is one indication of whether or not you have binge-worthy content on your site. But another indication, sometimes, this is hard to track. You can Google Analytics, like you can just see where people are going. But often you'll hear from people too. And I think podcasting, I hear that a lot from people. Like they'll say in the Facebook group, like I had a few people this week saying that they listened to a bunch of episodes, they're on a road trip, or someone will send me an email, say, I just discovered you, I listened to all your episodes. And I'm like, that's a lot because we're at episode 127 and I love hearing that. But I know the feeling because sometimes I will find a podcast and I will binge. Now, I think it's interesting to consider your own bingey behaviors as you're thinking about how to create binge-worthy content, because we don't all binge the same way. So kind of to go from there, when I listen to podcasts and binge on them, I sometimes will go from episode to episode to episode, but there are certain ones, like I'm a true crime buff. And by buff, I mean I like to listen to true crime podcasts. I'm not like a super googly nerd hanging out on sites all day, looking this stuff up. Unless I get super interested. But when I run into a new true crime podcast, I will not listen to everything. I will likely listen to the episodes I'm interested in. So a few of my favorite podcasts I have given up because they went into like a case I wasn't interested in or something like that. So if I discover a new one, like I started listening to True Crime Garage, and that's one that's super popular. So it's not like I just discovered it. Well, I just discovered it, but it's like super popular. And so I went back and listened to a whole ton of episodes, but just ones I was interested in when Rob and I were on a road trip. So you need to think about how you binge, but binging in general, like you want to do some things with your content that will give people that desire to keep on going. So let's talk about what some of those things are. So I did say Google Analytics is a good way to tell. Sometimes people will tell you, you can also ask, but I think at least in terms of a site, a website, that's a good indicator. It's not always easy to tell if you have binge-worthy content unless people are telling you or you're super good at tracking things. So the best thing that you can do is try to set that up and hope for the best, and then do what tracking you can. So here are the things that I would recommend trying. Some of them you can try together and some you could try separately. And again, I don't think it's always necessarily easy to tell if you have binge-worthy content, but you will start to hear it from people, which is excellent. So here are some of the things that can make content binge-worthy. Things that are serials, as in it is a continued story from piece of content to piece of content. And we all probably have heard of the podcast Serial, which is actually the first podcast I listened to when I started listening to podcasts 3 years ago. And I binged it. I remember walking around my neighborhood with a baby in a stroller, earphones on, just listening and listening and listening. And, it's not that many episodes, so it was pretty quick where I was like, what do I do with my life now? But week to week, they would kind of leave you hanging, and then they would give you a teaser for the next week's piece of content. And we can't always do that with our content, but when we can, that is a great way to get people really binging on the content because it's like they can't stop. And I think back to when Netflix was first on discs, and Blockbuster had a program too. I think we actually were Blockbuster people before we were Netflix people, where you could like rent and order DVDs in the mail through Blockbuster, and then you could return them to the store. So Rob and I got into 24, the show with Kiefer Sutherland, not on television. We've never been been big like on TV at the time people. We have like an antenna made of wood and nails and a coat hanger. It's a true story. And so we don't watch a lot of television, but we would go through these episodes of 24 because they would leave you at this moment of crisis. And you knew that in the first few minutes of the next episode, they would kind of resolve that crisis and move to the next, but you had to know. And I remember us like rushing out of the house with our Blockbuster discs to get to the Blockbuster store to see if maybe they would have the next ones in the season. So this is serial stuff, and you can't always create that, okay? These are things that may or may not fit, but you can consider how they would. And I think serial content can really work well through email. Like if you have email autoresponder sequences, where you're actually kind of putting that in, like, hey, I'll talk about that tomorrow in part 2 of this email series. That's a really great way that you can do it. Blog posts, you could have a part 1 and part 2, but I feel like that kind of content, sometimes the medium determines whether it's really binge worthy. I don't binge a lot of blogs. I don't know if you do. I used to. So I'm not sure if I'm the only one who has changed or if that's the way we all read. So again, we should have some discussions on this in the Facebook group. So again, creativewriting.com/community where we can talk about how you guys consume content and what kind of content. So the medium, I think, sometimes depends on that. But for blog posts, you could have a series. And if you do that, then you just have to do a really good job of tying one to the next, of getting people excited for the next, teasing at the end of the first piece of content what's coming up in the next piece of content. So another thing, and I've kind of touched on this a little, that will help your content be binge-worthy is an emotional investment. Now, this also plays into viral content, which we'll talk about, but when you have people who get emotionally invested in your content, they're much more likely to move from one piece to another. And again, this is one that may be hard for you. Like I'm trying to think of how creative writing could get you guys emotionally invested. And I don't know. So I don't know that this kind of content is necessarily the best for an emotional investment unless I scare you guys. Like actually some of my podcast episodes and blog posts that did the best were ones where I was like, the mistakes you might be making. And I wasn't being clickbaity, like they were real mistakes that you might be making. But when I talked about Amazon mistakes you might be making with the Amazon affiliate program or disclosure, and I actually called that episode Disclosure, You're Doing It Wrong. And that one had a ton of downloads. And I think, I shared it in a couple of Facebook groups, which I tend to do. Like I'll share some in the promo threads of other Facebook groups, but I see varying degrees of interaction with that. And I did see a lot of interaction from that post from people. There was like that emotional, like, am I doing it wrong? And the curiosity. I love curiosity, but also a little bit of fear in there. So your content may not have that ability to, get you emotionally invested. But once you are emotionally invested in a kind of content, then you stick around. And one example of this from Twitter would actually be the Dear David saga. And I don't know if you guys follow that at all, if you even are on Twitter or what you're doing. But if you didn't, you can Google Dear David Twitter and you'll find it. I actually found out about it late in the game and I haven't checked it out in a couple months. But when I found out about it, I read and read and read. So here's what it essentially is. I found an article, I think on Hello Giggles, that site that Zoe Deschanel started. And it was like, Dear David has pictures and you can't unsee this or something like that. One of those like, oh, I gotta see it, moments. And so I'm like, what is this thing? And there was a guy, so the post there broke it down. And then I had to go from that post to the guy's Twitter feed. But a guy in New York, I believe, started thinking his apartment was haunted. And so he started posting random tweets, some little things, some big things about the signs he saw. And it finally escalated to the point where he was posting videos of things moving in his house by themselves and his cats freaking out. And then actually images that he enhanced that showed this creepy, dead baby, not baby, I guess, creepy dead boy in his room. Now, I do not for one second believe any of it's true. I think it's a brilliant creation of art. I don't know what to call it, artistic expression over Twitter over some period of months where people are obsessing over this. And, I haven't checked lately to see what the latest status of Dear David is, but, this is the thing that millions of people started following this guy who is kind of I think he's a graphic artist. And I'm not sure what started this, but I really don't believe this is true. We don't have to get into ghosts, but I think it's way too contrived and anyway, whatever. That's what I think. We can talk about that also in the Facebook group if you disagree. But that's an example of how he used Twitter as a medium to create this story that captured like millions of people's attention and has gotten him featured in all kinds of places. I mean, again, if you Google it, you're going to see articles, I think, on like HuffPost and big sites that took notice where people are like, what is going on with this whole thing? So he got people emotionally invested. They were excited if they like ghost stories and fearful if you get freaked out by ghost stories, or both. And so people got emotionally invested with that journey and followed him along throughout months where this was going on. So that kind of ties into the next one, which is leading people along a journey. And so I won't say as much about this, but if you're able to sort of make it into a story, your content, so that it's all part of a bigger picture. And, thinking about like Story Brand by Donald Miller, where there's sort of this idea that your whole brand is part of a big story and you're weaving the story into the content you create and the ways that you interact on social media and otherwise. And I think that that's a really important thing to consider as you're creating content, is how does it fit into the bigger story? And, maybe you'll have little stories weaving throughout, like Dear David is a particular story that this guy's telling. And, the question really is like, what happens next? Because at some point you have to come clean, right, about whether this was true or not. And you can't keep the ghost forever. I mean, you can't keep up that intensity forever. So what's next? So you might have different kinds of stories or story arcs. And this is something we normally think about in a novel, but even in your online presence, you can actually consider how to do this. And again, all of these things, some of them lend better to certain kinds of mediums, but I think that it's really important to think about them, because all the time I'm seeing people think outside the box, like the Dear David saga again. That's something totally new and different, but it wasn't like it was super weird on Twitter. It was just something like, wow, how neat that this guy thought to do this. Although again, a lot of people believe it's true, I think, but I think it's a story. So either way, like how can you, with the kind of content you have and the mediums where you produce, how can you create a sort of story arc where you're leading people along a journey with you? Now, another aspect which has to do a little bit with the idea of being serial and the journey is the idea of having cliffhangers. And I want to talk specifically about this, though I did touch on it, because cliffhangers are, you know what they are, but I'm trying to think of some good examples of where you might find them in content. And I think a lot of times it happens not as much, again, in blog posts, but when you have podcast episodes and there's a teaser at the end, or you share that there's a big bombshell, or, anytime you're saying next time on whatever it is. So I do hear this a lot with podcasts. But if you're doing live videos, for example, maybe what you can do is plan out like, okay, if this is what live video you're doing, depending on what you're doing, whether it's on your Facebook group or page or on YouTube or wherever you're doing live content, Instagram stories, consider how you can create ahead of time a stopping point, and that where that stopping point is going to be something that's going to leave people with curiosity, because that's really what a cliffhanger does. So if you're like, well, I don't have a cliffhanger. Okay. Yeah, right. We're not all, mystery novels and whodunits, but what can you leave people feeling curious about? And that's maybe a better way to frame it for those of us who are creating nonfiction, or if we're talking about getting people engaged on Snapchat or Instagram stories. What is the curiosity factor that you can use at the end of a piece of content to create a bridge to the next? And so that's something that you're going to want to consider is, as you're planning out your content, even if it's something that's more off the cuff. Like a lot of times if I do a live video, which is pretty rare these days, but when I do, I have a very brief outline, and mostly I talk or answer questions or respond to people. But what would it look like for me to have a particular ending point, kind of like that final sentence, where instead of just being like, okay, guys, it's been enough time, I'm going to go now. Instead of that, if I had the like, okay, I've got to go, and in the next video, I'm going to share what it is I'm doing right now that's making me have to get off this video. And it has to do with cats. nothing right now has to do with cats in my life. But that's an example that I thought of off the cuff because this is how I plan my podcast episodes with an outline. I don't always have these specific examples. That one's pretty dumb, but you might have one. And if that were me listening, I'd be like, what is it with cats? Is it the cats curling video for the Olympics that people made? Because those are pretty awesome. But consider how you can end a piece of content with a curiosity factor that will keep people needing to come back for more. And the final thing I want to say about creating binge-worthy content is you have to know what people are interested in, or you don't have to, but this is one aspect that you can hone in on. If all of these things you're like, well, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. Okay, I get it. You might have a kind of content that makes it really difficult to create something binge-worthy. It may not even be possible, but again, think outside the box because you might have a hidden gem, a hidden idea, something totally unique that you could bring to the table and bring to a medium where it normally isn't a serial type of thing. So if you can consider what people are interested in, then you are going to get them hooked. And you won't always know what this is. Sometimes people don't know what that is, right? Like I'm thinking about the show Dexter, which I didn't really watch, but I know tons of people did. And who would have thought that so many people would like a show where the main character is a serial killer killing serial killers? Okay. That sounds a little dark, and it was, but millions of people watched. I actually just was hearing from a friend who's pregnant that she really liked the baby name. I think it was Harrison. Again, I'm not a watcher of Dexter, so I don't know, but she said that it had become too popular because of the show Dexter, that there's someone who had a baby named Harrison, and all of a sudden it skyrocketed that name up to the top of the list, kind of like with Friends years ago when I think, didn't watch that show either. I think they named their baby Emma, and then that became like, boom, like one of the top baby names. So you don't always know what people are interested in. I got off on like a little tangent there on baby names. But if you do know what people are interested in, if you already know like through Google Console and through analytics, what they're coming to your site for, what they're really reading, then maybe you could sit down and actually make kind of a content plan that's going to either maybe use one of these kinds of things, an arc or serial content where you're going to create a series of blog posts or a series of YouTube videos or podcast episodes or Instagram stories or even Facebook stories, whatever medium you are using, where you can take this subject that people are really interested in because you know they're already coming to you for that, and then apply one of these things in a creative way to it. Then you're going to get more people reading and continuing to read your content. Now, I want to leave you with some kind of specific nitty-gritties of what this might look like. And a lot of these have to do with blogs, but not all of them will. So some of the things that you can do specifically to work on this is that you can, in blog posts particularly, set it up and make it really easy for people to continue to the next thing. So a lot of people have a plugin, and I don't know the name because I used to use it, but I don't now, where it would share at the bottom of a post images from other posts that people should check out. But most of the time, those don't pull a related piece of content. It's just random pieces of content. So that isn't always super helpful. A lot of times, if I read a post I liked, I would go click on one of those, but only if they were interesting to me. Imagine if you created your own, and really like all you have to do is create like a header at the bottom, almost like what to read next or next up, or if you liked this, then, and then pick the next piece of content. You can use an image and make it clickable to the next link, or just text, whatever it is you want to do. And, you could consider, if you want to know if the binge factor is working, you could use a short link there so that and can track it, like a bit.ly, or I use Pretty Links, and you could use, instead of just linking to like creativewriting.com/my post about, you could do a short link like creativewriting.com bottom of, whatever it is that would make sense to you. And you can actually write a note to yourself in Pretty Links, like it's a plugin within WordPress, to say like, this is from the bottom of this post. And so you can actually go and look and see how many people have clicked it. So that would be a way that you could kind of track like, okay, is this working? But if you're being intentional and choosing those 4 people, then you are helping to create that, because you're creating a bridge that's easily accessed right to that next piece of content that falls in line. Some people will do this in the sidebar, if you have a sidebar, and people go back and forth about sidebars. I see why some people don't use them because it really focuses people on the content, but I really love a good sidebar. And often if a site has a good sidebar with intriguing content over there, I'm clicking all over that place. So I don't know about you. I do not have sidebar blindness. I do go over to the sidebar and click around, especially if I see things like popular posts. I have a little widget in mine that shows the popular posts. And so it tells you what other people are reading. And I think instead of calling it popular posts, I might have like what other people love. And then it has those posts. So that doesn't necessarily use the, story arc or maybe it uses some curiosity. It doesn't have a serial effect or any of those kinds of things, but it does keep people reading your content because there's like that social proof aspect of it where they're like, oh, this is popular. Here's what other people are reading. If you are using a series, whether this is on a blog post or something else, you could have a landing page for it where you have the links to all of the different content and people can reach the different content through there. But again, if you have a series, you also want to be linking to the next post there and maybe kind of giving a teaser for it so that people will continue to read that series. So you don't want to make it hard for them to get to the next one, but you also may not want to link to part 2 of the series in the middle of part 1 because you want them to get through part 1. So again, the whole goal is to get them. It's not necessarily time spent on the page or amount of each post read. You want to find people who love your content and want to keep reading. Okay, that's the goal. It's not necessarily some of those. It's not necessarily something that's going to bring you more advertising revenue. I mean, that one person who's reading 50 posts, if you're making money on ads, that's not going to do a ton for your ads, right? But you've created a fan, someone who's sitting there on your site reading 50 posts. Yep, they're a fan. And if you create more content, they're going to be there. They may tell their friends, they may buy your course or your book or whatever it is because they're a super fan. And that's what we really want. And that's really one of the things I want to help you guys find in this podcast that we're all searching for is how to turn those readers into raving fans. So in email, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but you can do this with your welcome series. There's a guy named this is funny. I'm not editing this out either. Andre Chaperon, and he has a whole course called Autoresponder Madness, which I have not taken, but I've heard him interviewed, and I actually got to hear him speak at the Smarter Artist Summit. He talks about, I think he calls it a soap opera sequence, an SOS, where he maps out these really intense and long email autoresponder sequences. And he calls them serial soaps because, soap operas, if you ever watch them, my grandma did. So I saw little bits and pieces, particularly one year we got our hardwood floors refinished. And so I spent a week at my grandma's and we watched soap operas. I don't remember which one, but I remember by the end of the week, I was like, I have to know what happens to these characters. My parents were like, we have to get you out of this house. Because I was 9. So anyway, he calls them soap opera sequences because at the end of each one, he does have a cliffhanger and he gives a really brilliant, one-line teaser. And then we'll say more on that tomorrow or more in part 2. And sometimes in the email subject lines, it'll say part 1, part 2. So you're giving people the expectation that this is a part of something larger and they want to keep going. And often there's something in us, I think, psychologically where we want to complete something. We don't want to read part 1 and not part 2. So that is one way that you can do that in email is by having a kind of cliffhanger and a teaser at the end and letting people know hey, I'm not going to fully answer this question until tomorrow. So one other thing that you guys can do to kind of, especially dealing with what people want to hear and read is using their language. So one of the things that was kind of cool when I got all these replies from you guys this last week from the Quick Fix about all the things you're reading, I got to hear how you all described what it was like to binge content. And so if I want to do more series or talk more about binging, I have your language that I can use and kind of parrot it back. I can put it in my blog post. I can say it in the podcast in ways that's going to make, it's going to make this content more identifiable to you. You're going to be like, yeah, that really sounds like me. And it's kind of, I'm always really weirded out by this advice in some way because I'm like, but that is me. It doesn't just sound like me. You took that from my email. I don't think there's anything unethical in that, but it is a little bit weird if you think about it. But it totally makes sense from the standpoint of getting people to actually identify with you, because you're identifying with them by kind of parroting and repeating back their language. So anytime you're able to kind of capture that, and obviously I'm not doing that right now, like I didn't do that with those emails, but that's a source where I could do that. Another one, if you have a Facebook group and you ask questions as people enter the group, you could ask like, hey, what are you struggling with? And then every time people join the group and answer that question, you could just pop it over into a spreadsheet, those answers. And so that you have kind of people describing for you their problems. And that's that's a great way for you to think about what kind of content to create or what kind of paid products to create. But it's also a great way to capture their language. And, if you're trying to figure out more about this binge-worthy content and trying to figure it out, one thing you could do is use something like HotDraw. And HotDraw is something I recommend, but I haven't actually used it. It's one of those things I recommend because people I love, like Bjork Ostrom from Pinch of Yum and Food Blogger Pro, he uses it, but it's basically like a heat map for your site that shows where people are clicking and looking. So if you have those kind of images at the bottom of every post, like, hey, check this out, they're not doing anything, like no one's clicking on this, then you'll know you need to change them. Maybe you need to go to a more targeted one. Maybe don't use images. Sometimes people get kind of blinded out after a while and you just need to change things on your site. I do that with email signups. Is every couple of months, if I remember, I will change where my forms are and things, because people who've been to the site and don't really see them, all of a sudden they're like, oh, look at this new thing. And they don't always know exactly what it is. They can't pinpoint it, but they know something's different and they'll notice a change. So I'm looking at the HotDraw site. You could try business free for 15 days and then downgrade to the free forever anytime. And so HotDraw, I'm not sure like what the pricing is for that. I'm not going to go into a lot of that now, but that's something you could do to kind of check out where people are going on your site. So maybe they're all going over to your sidebar. So that lets you know, okay, we need to figure out a way to kind of serialize this in the sidebar. One other thing you could consider, I know with Pop-Up Ally Pro, which is the tool I use, there's the option where you can create a pop-up that's specific to certain categories. So what if for all the posts that I have on my site about email, I have a specific pop-up that comes up that says like, not sure what to do next with your email, try this, and sends them to a particular page or I have a free email course, maybe that, or a particular post. And you could create specific pop-ups that are not to sign up for your email list, but that are to keep people reading, keep people on your site. So that's an interesting way that you could use that. I actually saw someone use a pop-up like that for time sensitive, like a webinar sign up or for some kind of book sale. And I thought that was really cool. I'm the person who forgets to take that stuff down. And so I don't always do like the time sensitive stuff because I'm really bad about taking it down. I just actually was on my site like maybe 2 weeks ago and saw at the very top, I have one of those smart bars. We're going to call mine a dumb bar because it said like pre-order my book for 99 cents. And I was like, my book came out in November. So yeah, mine's a dumb bar. It has changed now to the free planner, but you can do that. I'm not going to do the time sensitive stuff because I stink at it. But just consider, looking at a heat map, consider where on your site you can keep people propelled to read. And if you are someone doing a podcast or other formats, pay attention to what other people are doing in the space, especially if you are binging their content. Make a note. What is keeping me moving through the story? What is keeping me on this podcast instead of switching to the next podcast that's got a new episode? Why do I keep listening to this one? What is it about it that keeps me going? Why can't I get off this one guy's YouTube channel? What is he doing? What does he have on his end card? What are the little, I forget the actual names, annotations. I was going to say pop-ups in the video, but that's not what they are. The annotations in YouTube. What are the things that are keeping you moving through pieces of content? So you need to consider, okay, what is my content? What kind of content am I creating, in the online space? What will keep people reading? And how can I use the mediums that I use and apply some of these tactics and strategies to get people diving into the content, emotionally investing in your content, and then continuing to read and move forward with your content and not just bouncing away. So that's what I wanted to talk with you guys about today. And now that I'm done with that, I will share a little bit really quickly about what I binged last week, because I thought I was going to have a whole podcast episode about this and then didn't. So that thing that I binged was 13 Reasons Why. And I'm really like weirded out to admit this because the show's been out for a while. And if you don't know what it is, it's a show based on a novel, and it's about a girl who commits suicide. And so it's already like off the bat, it is just an emotionally heavy show. But I heard about it, a lot of people were watching it. There was a ton of controversy about the show, which I completely understand after watching it. But it was one of those things where I kept watching, and I was really conflicted about it because I'm still conflicted. I can't even put words to it. And this is why I decided not to have that episode on it. But it has a really interesting device in that the girl who did take her life narrates the show and created these tapes that are basically one tape for each person who was a part of the reason why she ended her life. And so she sets it up so somebody has to make all the different people listen to all the tapes, which is awful. And so like, this is a big source of my conflict, is that I hated that. Like, I think that is a just terrible thing. And anyway, I just hated that whole premise. But the fact is, it's a brilliant device to keep people watching, because you get through, each episode is about one particular person. You don't know who it's going to be until you get there. They don't say like the person's name in the episode title. It's just like the number. And so you're not sure. And sometimes you're not sure till like 20 minutes in who it's even about, as she tells the story and narrates it through the tape. So it was a really brilliant device. So as a person who creates content, I was like, this is genius. But I was also like, I hate this. And so I had to see it through to the end. I don't know that I could recommend it. I'm not sure, again, where I fall in the controversy. I don't know that it necessarily glorified suicide. I also can't say that it didn't, because I think in a lot of ways, the hero is the girl who did take her life, and you get this sort of satisfaction from seeing her find peace. But in reality, she didn't find peace. And that's anyway, really sensitive subject. I'm sure those of you guys listening, like many of us, I don't know if it's most, I don't know the stats, know someone who's taken their life. And I do in my life. And, so it's just a very sensitive topic. It was helpful in some ways to think about things to talk with my kids about, not necessarily just about that, but just a lot of the show was about the way men and boys treat women and girls. And, especially coming on the heels of the Me Too movement, which I did write about on KirstenOliphant.com. I feel like that's super relevant, and it kind of reminded me as a mom of both boys and girls of things I want to teach my kids about how to treat each other. So all that to say, I was going to say a lot in the episode, and I had a list, and then I was like, no, I'm just too conflicted. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I did respond to a lot of you guys who emailed me back after the quick fix last Friday to share that that's what I did. But I was always like, how are people going to view this? Because it was a super controversial show. So again, a lot of heavy content, a lot of language, really graphic scenes. So I will not recommend it necessarily unless you think you can handle those things and you feel like it would be good for you. My husband, as I was closing it out, because he did not watch it with me, there's a lot of shows we don't watch together, he caught bits and pieces as he was like wandering through the house, doing different things last week when I was like glued to the television. And at the last episode, he watched the last 9 minutes because it was like our time to watch something fun together. And he was like, when is this over? And I was like, 9 minutes. I can't stop. It's the last episode. Just sit here with me. And he watched it with me and it was over. He was like, do you enjoy that? And I was like, no, I really didn't. Like, I had to finish it. And this is the whole thing about binging that got me interested in wanting to talk about this. But I did have to finish it, but it was not enjoyable. Like, I feel like it was much more of a not learning. I mean, it was so familiar to me. I mean, the tools are different in high school now with all the technology, but like, it's like, this is all very, very familiar to me. But it was, I don't even know how to have the words to describe, which is why I did not, in fact, make this episode all about it. And that's about all I'm going to say. So I would love to continue this conversation about binging content, about different mediums, ideas for how you can create binge-worthy content. So we're going to talk about that this week in the Facebook group. Head over to creativewriting.com/community so you can join. It's free. It's a great group of people. It's not a promotional group. So come in and look around to kind of see what the conversations are about. But I definitely will have some conversations related to this idea of binge-worthy content and how to create it. And I will be also having an episode on viral content, which is they don't go hand in hand necessarily, but there are two different pieces that can be really important in terms of finding new readers and fans and then taking them deeper into that relationship with you. So I will have the show notes up this week with some links. And if you like to read, you'll find those things there. And that will be at creativewriting.com/127. I'm so glad that you are here listening, whether this is your first time or your 127th time. It's great to have you. So happy to have you in the community. So happy that you are letting me into your earbuds or through the speakers of your car. And I hope that you'll let me come back next week. So for now, go create content that you love and serve your people well.